Welcome to Musicians versus the World, the podcast where we explore aspects of music and musician life that may not have been covered in music school. I am your host, Christine Smith. Today, we are talking with accomplished composer Andrew Morgan Smith, who has successfully navigated the world of both film and concert composition. We are talking about workflow, working with orchestrators, scoring sessions that span the globe, and keeping up with the latest technological innovations in the music world. Andrew Morgan Smith is a veteran composer who has scored over 65 feature film and television projects, including The Old Way, You Might Be the Killer, and Disney's The Owl House. In the last 10 years, he has scored more than 90 projects across all media. In addition to his film and TV work, Andrew has written various concert works. These have been performed and recorded all over the world with groups ranging from the London Symphony Orchestra, Hollywood Chamber Orchestra, and the Acadian Wind Symphony. Smith has also been a featured guest lecturer at New York University, Loyola University, Emory University, Louisiana State University, the University of Louisiana System, and high schools around the country. And I'm so excited to talk with him today. So Andrew Morgan Smith, thank you for being here and welcome to Musicians versus the World.
Thank you so much, Christine. I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk with me. I know that you're super busy. I've heard your concert works and your works for film, and I just love what you do. So I'm excited to talk with you. Thank you so much for being here. Are you, so to kind of get started, I'd love to get a little background on you. Is being a composer, is that something you've always known you wanted to do, or did that come a little bit later in life?
So, my family, my father is a musician who turned lawyer. So we always had music around us as kids. So I remember listening to a cassette tape of a Boston Pops recording called Pops in Space, which is John Williams conducting the Boston Pops with a bunch of different film scores in it. Some of his, some others, some other composers' stuff. And I remember as a small kid making up the story, for what was going on. I probably wasn't even old enough to see most of the movies on the cassette,
Mm-hmm.
And took piano lessons, did band, played guitar, all kinds of stuff. And I always really enjoyed music. It was always part of my life, but I never saw it as like a career, right? I never saw it as a thing I wanted to do full time. I wrote a little bit of music. I composed some things, but overall, until high school, I didn't really see it as a career opportunity.
Yeah.
And
well, what was the turning point for you? No. What was the turning point for you?
I think the turning point really came. I saw Pirates of the Caribbean in the theater, and for whatever reason, it really resonated with me. I don't know. I grew up watching Star Wars all the time, loved the music, all kinds of stuff. But for whatever reason, that was the moment of like, oh, this is what I want to do.
Really?
And yeah, it was, I don't know. It seems so strange. It's not Pirates. I mean, it's a fun movie. It's a great movie, but it's not a movie that I am like super on top of all the time, like I'm super into all the time. But for whatever reason, it just resonated at that moment,
Yeah.
And from that point forward, I kind of put all of my energy towards wanting to do that. So ended up going to college for music media, which is like kind of a amalgamation of a bunch of different stuff at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And ended up going to the Aspen Music Festival for their film scoring class, which they don't have anymore, but they did at the time. And that was the goal, was to go to USC for their master's program.
Right.
Life had different ways of going about things, but that was the goal,
Right. So you didn't end up going to USC. How did you end up going from Louisiana to this career of writing and having orchestras play your pieces, having wind ensemble play your pieces? There's a lot of composers that they finish their schooling and then it's kind of like, now what?
Yeah.
What was your now what?
Well, so really the benefit that I had of going to a small school, so like university, UL, the University of Louisiana, everyone knows who you are and kind of what you want to do because it's a smaller music school.
Yeah.
And they all knew what I wanted to do was be a film composer. I'd been very transparent about it whenever we started. I had met with the composition teacher. I had met with at the time, the head of the music media department. And and they kind of let me do whatever I wanted. Like in the sense of like, as long as I was doing what the curriculum, I was still fulfilling the curriculum, but they kind of let me alter things to be more film scoring centric versus maybe like audio engineer centric or something like that.
Gotcha.
So, so, and on the side, I was doing other things. So on the side, I was writing for commercials. A friend of mine had hired me. He did football videos for a high school locally and promo videos. And I was scoring these promo videos and doing commercials and doing kind of other stuff outside of school that fit in with what I wanted to do. I was also reaching out to former graduates of the USC program and picking their brain on stuff and learning from them. And then I reached out to USC because the only way to get in at the time was through a master's program or equivalent professional experience. And I reached out and said, well, what is equivalent professional experience, right? And they gave me they said, oh, go to the Aspen Music Festival, go to the ASCAP scoring workshop. Like those things count towards that. So everything became, okay, well, now I want to get into those things. And then I also asked, hey, do any of your teachers do correspondence lessons? So I was doing correspondence lessons with a man named Jack Smalley, who taught there, right? So outside of school, I was kind of doing all these things already. And I was able to kind of take the resources of the school and point it towards my goal, right? Which was really valuable to me. To have that support backing of, oh, well, most schools, like if you have a recording program, you have access to microphones and a studio and all kinds of stuff that as a college student, you don't usually have access to, Right. So that was very valuable. So on the side of, on the college side, I was always kind of driving towards this goal. And what ended up happening was I went to the Aspen Music Festival. Jack Smalley, my teacher I was doing lessons with, actually taught there. And so I go to this, it was a month-long program for 5 composers. And he calls me before he comes up and he says, hey, there's somebody who dropped out of the USC film scoring program. I want to talk to Brian about getting you in, because I'd been working with him for a number of years and all kinds of stuff. And I really thought about it hard. And I said, Jack, I appreciate it. That would be amazing. But I have 1 semester left in college. At the time, I was going to get a double concentration degree. And I knew a ton of people who had gotten picked up for bands or gotten picked up for gigs or whatever and never went back and finished, right? And I said, look, I have 1 semester left. Like, I just need, and it was only a couple classes. So I said, I need to finish this before, and in my head, I was like, well, I'll just go and reapply the next year. That was what I was thinking. Right. So he understood and he respected that. And I really appreciated his offer to try and do that. And so I finished up the program. We recorded with live orchestra. We also worked with David Newman and Jeff Rona, who are also great composers. And I come back to Lafayette, which is where this school was that I was attending, and still is there. And there was a company in town making TV movies. Like that's like what they had been doing for a few years at that point. And so I took my demo, I put it on a CD, wrote my information on a CD, went to their offices. And I went in, there was nobody in the building except for a PA. So like just some, one step above an intern. And I was like, hey, I'm a composer. Here's my CD, and I hand it to them. And the guy just was like, all right. And I walk out and I was like, well, that's it, not hearing from these people again. And I was in a class, it was a history class, and I got a phone call from a 310 number. I was like, that's weird. Like, who on earth, who's calling me from a 310 number? Yeah. I get out of class and I check my voicemail, and it was a director who was working for them who basically called and said, hey, I picked up your CD off of a desk with a bunch of other stuff, and I brought it to my car. And because it was just on the seat, I decided to put it in. And I didn't know if you wanted to come and talk about maybe scoring a movie for us.
Wow.
So I went and I auditioned, and that was my first real commercial project. My first real commercial project was because I took a chance and I dropped this off, and the guy picked it up with a bunch of other stuff,
That's amazing.
And that company went on to do, 30, 40 TV movies over the next 10 years and then split and would do, I'd work for both companies and all kinds of stuff. So I got a lot of experience really quickly. That's why I have a ton of feature credits, is because, you learn those 10,000 hours really build up whenever you're doing them back to back to back to back to back.
Yeah.
And I was grateful for the opportunity to learn like that, because most people, especially outside of Los Angeles, don't get that chance to make those mistakes
Right.
and to learn things on these different projects,
Right, right. So what was some things that surprised you on that first project?
Well,
Like everything.
you learn, yeah, you learn a whole lot really fast whenever you're thrown into the deep end.
Right.
I mean, I learned, it wasn't on that movie, but I learned you had to have I did not have a very good way for delivery, right? Like, I did not have a way to do delivery. And I remember I stayed up all night delivering this movie, like and I didn't even deliver it properly, if I'm being completely honest. Like, I didn't know what I was doing. And so I literally stayed up all night, like 24 hours, getting all the files exported and doing everything. And I walk onto set of the next movie and I hand he was producing the next movie, but I hand this director the hard drive and he looks at me and he's like, "You haven't slept, have you?" And I was like, "No, I have not slept," But, it did open up like some amazing collaborative, a good friend of mine, a good friend of mine who plays fiddle. He played on that score and he's played on everything. Like, he's played, not everything. He's played on a bunch of stuff. Like, anytime I need fiddle, I have him playing. So he played on
Mhm.
a movie that released last year called The Old Way. He played fiddle on that, and he was on my first film score, right? And right along with me, learning on some of these formats.
Wow. That's amazing. I love that you took what you had and you went with it. And now you have this huge full career of writing so much music. Your career also has concert music. Where does that fit in when you're making, 90 film projects, TV movie projects, and here you are writing concert music? Where does that fit in with all of this?
Who knows? No, it really is. It's a fun outlet, because so many film scores are kind of I mean, more and more people are hearing more film, like they're doing film score lives, and Hans Zimmer is doing stuff, and those are
Right.
amazing shows, and I think it really has been fun to see film scores themselves become more popularized as something to watch in a concert hall.
Hmm.
But for me, the fun thing about a concert piece is that it's kind of it's almost like the film score is the album recording, right?
Hmm.
And that's how it's produced and that's what it's done. And then the concert music is like the live show, right? Where it's only this one time. It's never going to be played again exactly the same way.
Right.
You get a lot more interaction with the players versus it's just a different medium, right? Where whenever you're in the concert hall, it's more about the energy of the experience. Like, there's mistakes. There are things that happen that in film score, because it's that album, you need to have everything be as good as possible, right?
Right.
Whereas in a concert hall, mistakes happen and they just are gone. Oh, there goes, a wrong note, or there goes some weird intonation issue or whatever. And it's just done. And you get to have more direct connection with the musicians, usually, at least whenever I'm able to be there and actually talk to them.
Hmm.
I mean, I grew up being a musician. I played in wind ensembles. I played in orchestras.
Right.
And I always loved hearing from the composer and having the composer be there and be able to be a part of that. So it's just a different outlet, which is a lot of fun.
Hmm. What do you say to these musicians when you come? Like you say, you want to go to the premiere. I know you went to the Acadia premiere of one of your pieces recently. So what advice do you give to those musicians as they're playing your pieces, especially if it's like a world premiere of one of your pieces?
It kind of depends, right? I do find it interesting to listen to the conductor as to how they interpret something, right? I
Hmm.
can give insight to, so at the Acadian Wind Symphony's example, their I wrote a piece to celebrate their 30th anniversary of being founded. And this is a organization I've played in, my father played in, my wife has played in with me. So the organization itself means a lot to me, right? And to the local community. So, so there was input beforehand, right? So I worked closely with the conductor of giving feedback or getting feedback, or what do you want this to be about? What's the whole goal or idea behind it? So whenever it's that way, there's been a dialogue beforehand already. There's been kind of a discussion of, hey, this is what the goal is. This is what we're looking for. This is what, what's the idea behind it in those cases. Other times, I kind of like to sit back and see what the conductor is doing and what like we talked about it, like if it's an ephemeral thing of just like, it just is there. Right. And so sometimes, there's a million different interpretations of Beethoven and how you would do different things and how people interpret different parts of writing or Sousa or whatever. And I think that that's tremendously interesting to hear all these different parts, right? I give instructions and then I like to see what happens,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there anything that you have to kind of switch gears when you are composing for, say, like a high school level composition versus something that that like a professional chamber orchestra or a professional wind ensemble is going to be performing? What sort of things do you have to keep in mind with these different genres?
I try not to do too much. I mean, obviously, the difficulty level becomes a big question, right? So that's going to be endurance, range. Sometimes the conductor, depending on who the conductor might be. If it's a really difficult or demanding piece on the conductor, that might be a problem. And that's kind of where it stops from, like the framework idea, right? Okay. If I'm composing for, say it's a piece for a publisher, they do have specific guidelines of, like, they have like grade levels, right? And within those grade levels, they have different qualifications for that grade level. Like if you're writing really low early band music, you can't write more like faster notes than whatever it is, like an eighth note or something. You can't. Right. They have like a rhythmic cap and then a range cap, right? So generally, I just keep in mind, and they'll tell me. So the Acadian Wind Symphony, I said, do whatever you want. We want it to be hard. They were like, it needs to be hard. Whatever, it needs to be impressive. It needs to be hard. That's what we need. Whenever I recorded, when I composed for the Lafayette High, there was a band director who was retiring after, I think it was 30 years as well, 25, 30 years, who had been a big, influence on the community. They said, we want a piece like this, and it gave us a range. And they gave me also, like, these are our better players. So if you want to feature a player, we would suggest you do these things, But I try to write. There was, I don't even know. Can't even attribute to anybody. But there was I think my dad told me this. My parents wrote a book years ago, and they were like, you write your first draft with your heart, and then you do your second draft with your brain, right? Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that idea, right? Like, go with your gut with your first version. And then you compare stuff back. You can always go back and say, oh, actually, this is out of range. This is too hard. This is too much. And often, because of my background as a film composer, I'm able to deliver mock-ups to the people who commissioned me and give them a pretty good idea of what it's going to sound like, right? So they can say, oh, yeah, no way. Like, we can't do X, Y, Z, or we love this. We don't like this. More of this. So to some extent, too, I think they get a little bit more of an idea of what it's going to be because of my background. I don't compose. I used to compose in Sibelius and all that kind of stuff. I don't write in notation software anymore. So whatever I do, I send it to whoever's orchestrating, and then they deal with all of that stuff at this point. But that's kind of that's like the short long version of that, I guess.
That is so interesting. So you used to work with the Baileys, and now you use an orchestrator to help. What do you send them? Do you send them just kind of like the MIDI mock-up and they orchestrate it for you?
Yeah, so I try to send them as much information as I can. I send them the MIDI data for the actual files. I work in Logic. I write in Logic now. And I send them the MIDI data for each instrument. And then I will send them also stems for each instrument. So, I'll send them, and I can go further into breakdowns for them if they want it. So, I for the more recent concert works, I did stuff like brass, percussion, woodwinds, and then just sent them that stuff with the MIDI. And then for film score, I usually am doing the same thing. And if I need to go further into stems, or if they have a question, I can always pull it. I could always go deeper into that, I actually, at the Aspen Music Festival, this is whenever I realized I couldn't write in Sibelius anymore, because I used to write stuff in Sibelius and then export the MIDI and then program it and then have to re-import it and all kinds of stuff. And Jeff Rona was like, "You're not one of those people who does everything backwards, right?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "You don't write in Sibelius and then export it and then re-import it again." And and that was when I was like, "Oh gosh, I can't do that anymore, I guess." Which, I mean, it is like a tremendous amount of time versus like they're just, if something's not going to be live, notating it extra, like it's just extra work. Like if I'm not going to record this instrument, me writing it out as a composer, I feel more as if I'm a composer, but I need to program it, and a lot of sounds don't really go one-to-one from your DAW to, or from Sibelius to your DAW or whatever. So it's just faster to perform it like a performer than to try to do all that over again.
Yeah, and then you can import it from your DAW into Sibelius, and then it's easier to clean it up that way than to clean it up the opposite way.
For sure, and that's also how most people work now. So it's just kind of the standard to work in a DAW. It's definitely the minority of people working from the notation software to the DAW.
Well, that's interesting. So coming from, Sibelius background where you used to do it first that way, when you are working in your DAW, do you have like a harmonic, like maybe some chords written out, or are you all doing it by ear and then fleshing it out that way? You're composing.
I'm all doing it by ear. I mean, I may have some kind of shorthand, or if I've done a lot of times I'm doing pre-sketches of themes or ideas that I can kind of pull from. But I generally don't have anything written out in a traditional sense. Like I'll go to my piano downstairs and I'll, take my voice memos and take something down, usually with my kids screaming in the background. But like, it's definitely not something so formal. I try not to have that be, I don't want to be constrained by that thought, especially in film score. It's just, I very rarely am thinking in, oh, well, this is the 2-5-1 of this key. And sometimes there are movies that do that. I did a movie called Oval Portrait, which has not come out yet, but the score is very, like 1950s, 1960s style scoring. So it's very heavy. It's very complicated. It's very, and I had to very much get into that mindset of like, okay, we're going to get to this key. We need to go, 2-5-1 in this key, and then we're going to go here, then we're going to go here, and then we're going to do an extension. And like that was probably in recent memory the most theoretical that I have been versus, and there's a lot of still emotive, just, okay, well, this is what I'm doing, but it's all by piano. Like it's all on the keyboard. I'm not dealing into the notation even in Logic. I'm just going off piano roll and just getting the sound in my ear, listening to other scores in the time period and getting the sound in my ear, and then realizing I still did the theory, but without any kind of notation.
Gotcha. No, that makes sense. And so I know with orchestrators, sometimes they fill in things and they'll add little runs here or there just to make things sound more orchestral. Do you have your pieces completely laid out exactly as you want them before you send them to the orchestrator, or do you expect them to fill things in for you a little bit?
In my case, it's usually pretty filled out. I know people who have done the opposite, and occasionally my orchestrator will give me suggestions. Andrew Osano will give me suggestions. He's a cellist by training, I just pretended to play upright bass in orchestra. So like, I definitely trust his intuition and his feedback. Right. So especially when it comes to effects, like effects are a whole different ball game, because you can get lost in all these different ideas, and you have to explain them sometimes to the players, because they're not, you'll write out. So it's like, say, make it sound glassy. And it's like, well, what does that mean? And a lot of players who do it a lot know what to do, but sometimes you don't. So he'll sometimes suggest things, or he'll suggest a little doubling, or he'll put a cue. And I always tell him, like, put a cue in, and if you have an idea, then we can always on the day play it. If we don't like it, we just say, hey, don't play the cue anymore. And then it makes it pretty simple in that case, So for what I usually work on, I usually am pretty exacting. Now, I think where that gets more grayed out does go into, if I'm not an expert in a genre that somebody else is an expert in, or time, right? Time becomes a huge thing whenever you're racing through a film score. Some people are just churning and burning on these projects, and they're tremendously difficult or tremendously busy, and they just say, hey, here are the chords. Can you just kind of fill in? Here's like the beats of the action. Here's that stuff, but I need it to be in this style, right? I need it to be in the style of Back to the Future or whatever it is. And then they can kind of fill in the instrumentation and the ornamentation. But usually for me, if I put something down and it's not like an ensemble chord, right? If I use an ensemble patch or something, then they understand. I'll try to limit the voices to however many voices we have, but they understand, okay, we need to orchestrate that out for everybody. Gotcha. But generally I try to be as informative as I can.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Now on your YouTube channel, you have a lot of videos, and especially for Average Joe, you showed videos of the actual scoring sessions with the orchestra and everything. Can you walk us through what a day is like what a scoring session is like for you as a composer?
Sure. It's tremendously stressful. Well, getting up to that point. So another part of that is you got to trust, before I even get to that point of being at the session, I have to trust the people who I'm working with. Right. So getting to that point is probably a whole nother discussion. But so I usually have my team of people. So I have at least my orchestrator and my engineer on the call with me. So Average Joe is an example. We recorded that in Bulgaria. I live in South Louisiana. My orchestrator lives in Michigan. My engineer lives in Germany. So we're all on this call together. Wow. Typing back and forth to each other of like, hey, do we have a good take on this or whatever? But so just we all are on this call with, usually they'll use audio movers or Source Connect or something. And we can watch on Skype so we can see the orchestra recording and give feedback. But usually, I'm up early in my studio, 4 a.m. or something. No, they're going to be recording in the evening, but we'll be recording for our time. It'll be 4 a.m. or something. And, I have my coffee and hopefully I'm in my pajamas or something. And we go ahead. And as you're hearing feedback, it's almost as if you're in the control room of a recording studio, right? They do a take. I usually have the score out in front of me and I can mark, okay, we need a better pass on measure 13. We do that. Okay, can we do from here to here? We'll do here, like measure 11 through measure 17. Our goal is to have a better take of measure 13 and measure 15 or something, And you just go through the process of the whole project, right? It's like creating an album, like we talked about earlier. You want to try and get as good of a take of each element, because this is going to be memorialized forever. You don't want to have, oh man, I wish we had gotten one more take of, measure 11 again and again and again. And, usually the format for most places is you're doing 50 minutes of recording and 10-minute breaks for musicians. So you're not wearing them all out. And then the other thing that you often do in film scoring sessions is you do what's called striping. So for Average Joe, we only did strings. But on a movie like I did in the past called The Old Way or Bunker, which is a horror movie, we did strings and woodwinds together for both of those movies, and then we did brass separately. And there's a good reason for that, which is strings and woodwinds blend really well together. They're not like woodwinds are not super in your face, but the brass, especially in certain spaces, can be very, very. They're just everywhere, right? Sonically, they're just very loud. So 10 to 15 brass players can overwhelm a smaller string section if you don't set them up in the right space. So recording them separately gives you a lot more control over what the recording sounds like. And you can do things like double strings up. You can do all these different tricks that you can't do whenever you're recording 2D with everyone in the room. Although recording 2D with everyone in the room gives a certain energy that is hard to match,
Right.
But yeah, that's kind of the structure of everything, whenever you're going through there.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're all the way across the world. So everything has to be perfect as far as the score, the sheet music, everything has to be perfect before you even go there, because I can't imagine you can make last minute fixes when you're on a completely different continent.
They're pretty flexible. I mean, you do want to be as time is money, right? And having all those musicians sitting in a room is expensive. So the longer you sit and try to figure out, oh my gosh, like, where's that mistake? Is that on our part? Is it on their part? Like, okay, now we have to stop and have them play through the part and say, okay, is this on our end or is this on it's like, so you do want it to be as clean and clear as possible, because I'd rather the mistake be on a musician playing a wrong note and not because we have to search out this issue. Right.
Right. Yeah.
So you do want to be as clear and clean as possible before you get over there, which goes back to talking about, making sure that my delivery because usually you deliver Pro Tools sessions for all the tracks you're going to record. So making sure my deliveries are all correct. So I'll always sit with the scores, usually the day before, and go through or whatever day before I deliver the Pro Tools sessions, I'll go through and listen through and make sure the click track is correct for each thing and make sure there's no problem. And I've had to adjust things the day before because I realized, oh, wait a minute, like we got our fingers or our wires crossed here somewhere, but that goes back to, you got to trust the people you're working with and know, okay, well, they're going to get things fixed and they're going to fix my mistakes. We're going to check and make sure that they don't have mistakes. And hopefully the best case scenario is just, like I said, someone played a wrong note in the room and that's it,
You just do another take and it's good to go.
Exactly. That's what you want.
So you were mentioning striping, where you record the brass separately from the woodwinds and the strings. In Average Joe, you also had some synthesizers in there. How do you fit that in? And then I also know in the old way you had some fiddle and you had some other things that kind of extended the traditional orchestra. How does that fit in with scoring and with recording?
Yeah, so I think it was Jerry Goldsmith said that he always tried to add some element to every score that would make it interesting for him as well as for the score to be unique. And so I've definitely taken that philosophy as much as I can. I like to do things that are either a little bit different or a little bit unique, just to keep things fresh and interesting, and we're not, rehashing the same score a million times.
Right.
And so on Average Joe, it's a kind of a weird, genre-wise, it's kind of a weird movie. It's really, at its core, it's a love story. It's a love story between these two characters who are real people, but these two characters who have meet through childhood, become like childhood sweethearts, and then all the way through their life to present day. And all the different things that happen to them affect them in different ways, right? But within that movie, it's a love story. It's a courtroom drama. It's a football movie. It's a pretty heavy drama in some places. So there's some Christian film elements to it. And so there was an early discussion of, okay, well, it's all these things, but we don't want it to sound like any one specific genre. Like, we're not making a football movie because we're not doing, we're doing these other things, and we're not making a Christian film. We're doing these other things, and we're not. So there was an early discussion of, okay, well, how is this going to be its own unique thing? So but we want to pay homage to those things. We don't want it to pretend like we're not making those things, but it has to have its own identity. So
Right.
the synthesizer stuff came up because I mean, I've been working with modular synthesizers for about a year, playing with them, and they're very fascinating to me. And so we had this bass formulation that was really working well of this orchestra plus guitar stuff, but it just felt a bit more like this cliched vibe. Just because we've heard it a million times, right? Like we've heard the overly saccharine piano on Lifetime movies a million times. And that's why people think it sounds so cheesy, is because they've heard it so many times, right? So I had this idea of, well, what if I take these other synthesizer elements, like these modular synthesizer elements, and some other kind of non-traditional synths. So something like a Lyra 8, which is a pad synthesizer, but makes these wild, crazy noises. Like, do I I add those things into this score and add them for texture and ideas. So instead of doing cymbal swells, we're doing like these weird noise swells with the Lyra 8 and all that kind of stuff. And that's where that came from, getting feedback from the production and them really liking the direction that it felt familiar, but also felt new.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's really neat. So did you lay down all of the tracks with the orchestra first and then add the synthesizers?
It sort of depended on which scene.
Okay.
What I would often do, though, there's a synthesizer called the Moog Subharmonicon. And basically it's this 2 oscillator synth that you can it's not actually random, but you can set it to have these they call it, I think, a polyrhythmic synth, where you can set these 4 different on each oscillator, 4 different options for timing changes. And you set the pitches, and then you can change how fast they change on the different notes, right? And you can basically create these like really weird time, like sometimes things line up, sometimes things don't line up. So it feels very, very it feels random. It's not fully random, but it feels random.
Gotcha.
And I would use that to create these sound beds and these, because it would be tonal. So I'd make these beds where it's just a lot of verbs, delays, all kinds of stuff. And I would put that in there in kind of the key that I wanted it in. And then I would go back behind that and then add the orchestra parts in and the guitar parts in.
Okay.
And then I'd go and maybe do another pass of synthesizer on the top of that to kind of be the last little icing on the top. But sometimes you didn't even need the orchestra. So if it worked with the pad, we just did the pad, right? We just did the synth. We just did the synth. And then on other parts, sometimes if it was more intimate, sometimes we would just do the orchestra and then maybe fill in a little bit of the synthesizer on the back end.
Gotcha. That must have been so much fun, because synthesizers just seem like so there's so much freedom to experiment with them. So that must just have been so freeing and fun for you to add these different layers and textures to it.
Yeah, I think that over the last year especially, the idea of getting away from the keyboard has been very enticing to me, not because I dislike writing by keyboard, but because I think so many times we end up always approaching things from the same home position, right? Like we always end up approaching things from the same position because we're so used to it. So you pull open the keyboard, or perfect example, right? If a songwriter is a guitarist, a lot of times they're going to write stuff in E, right? Because it's like D, G, E, C. These are the things that we always gravitate towards because they're comfortable in that instrument. So for me, it's very helpful to be able to get away from that and get something like the Lyra 8 doesn't have keys on it. It has like touch interface, right? It has like capacitors that you touch that make different sounds, or like the Subharmonicon creates these random kind of vibe things. There's thunder above me, so hopefully you can hear that. But Moog is coming to get me. But that kind of thing, I think, helps to get me out of my box, right? Out of my do things differently, approach things differently, think about things differently versus always doing the same. Here's the chord progression in D minor. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, man, this has been so much fun to listen to you and to learn from you because you have experience both in the traditional and then you're still stretching and learning and getting yourself out of your box. And I love that so much. As we finish up here, what advice do you have for aspiring musicians or aspiring composers?
I think my biggest thing and this goes for any kind of art, I think, is whatever you want to do, you should start doing it now. So, if you want to be a filmmaker, we have phones in our pockets that are better cameras than most people had access to in 2002, even filmmakers had access to in 2002, if you want to be a musician, if you want to be a composer, there are a ton of free audio software out there that you can work on an iPad and just mess with and learn and really get into, Same thing as a musician. If you want to be a musician, traveling musician, you're practicing, you're doing things, you're getting yourself out there. There's no reason for you to not be pursuing those things in today's world, because there's no gatekeepers, right? There's no, you can go to any distribution network and get your music on every distribution hub, YouTube has really democratized video making, and I think that as artists, right? Like all these different things, if you're a painter, you can sell your artwork on Etsy, on Facebook Marketplace, on whatever you want. There's more opportunity than ever for us to express ourselves, put our artwork out there. And the more at bats you have, the more tries you have, the earlier you start, the better off you are in the long run. 15 years from now, 20 years from now, if you started like me making all those mistakes on my first movie, well, I'm glad I'm not making those mistakes now, Right. So I think that the sooner you can get those hours in learning and practicing and honing your art, the better off you're going to be.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned YouTube. You have a YouTube channel. If people want to learn more from you, because you are just you have so much experience and so much wonderful advice for people, how do people find you?
You can find me as Andrew Morgan Smith Music on YouTube. I am A Music S on a lot of platforms, or just Andrew Morgan Smith. I'm the only Andrew Morgan Smith composer that shows up on any search engine now. There used to be another one. I feel bad for him, but but yeah, so that's that. I'm Andrew Morgan Smith on most platforms, or wherever you want to stream music from.
Okay, great. Andrew Morgan Smith, thank you so much for being here. It has been such a pleasure talking with you. You've taught me so much, and I just wish you all the best. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.